So I'll declare the meeting open, and this is a special meeting of the Toowoomba Regional Council, specifically to talk about the Toowoomba region's futures, the Toowoomba region's growth plan and the preferred growth option. As we begin, can I welcome those who are watching this meeting live stream to the meeting? And I'd like to thank each and every one of those of our staff and, of course, my council colleagues who are in the room today, and acknowledge that people are also watching this particular subject on the social media channels. In opening the meeting, can I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse these lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, the Guyabal, and of course, in my own case at Normerran, the Biggambil people, and can I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, the rich traditions and the bold ambitions of Australia's first people. There are no apologies. Anybody with any declarations of any sort? If not, I'll hand over to Michelle Milton and she will begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Good afternoon, councillors, staff present today, and to everybody at viewing online as well. I'd also like to acknowledge and introduce those assisting me with today's presentation of this report, including our Senior Planner, Carl Bock, who will provide an overview of the growth options before us today. And we also have Malcolm Griffin and Shannon Batch of PSA Consulting, who have been undertaking the preparation of this strategy with Council. We're really excited to bring this report to you today on the Toowoomba Growth Plan options. It marks a significant milestone in the Toowoomba Futures program. And the purpose of the report today is to seek your endorsement on a preferred growth option for the Toowoomba region. Today, we are seeking a determination of the preferred approach to managing growth and change that will guide the urban settlement pattern for a period of 30 or more years. The direction about Council's preferred option enables us to finalise the growth plan study, and the outputs of that study, including data that provides necessary planning assumptions about the type, scale and location of development and the broad sequence for future growth. These outcomes are important for us to inform the next phases of land use policy planning through the development of the planning scheme and infrastructure planning to ensure that we cater for future urban growth. It will provide direction about how Council wishes to focus its policy planning efforts and ensure that these will be expressed in the new planning scheme. The Toowoomba region has historically experienced stable population growth with affordable housing and high standard of livability in a very attractive environment. The Toowoomba region is now at a critical point for change, which has been most evident over the last 5 to 8 years with the delivery of some of our region-shaping infrastructure projects, major redevelopment in the city centre and the growth of our suburbs. The combined factors of steady population growth, jobs and employment economic growth, as well as the changing and evolving community expectations, will have a direct influence on the region's growth for decades to come. A growth strategy is needed to capitalise on these significant opportunities in the region and to ensure that there is an adequate supply of housing and employment lands to meet the needs of our community with a forecast through to 2051. It is important that this growth is properly planned and delivered in a coordinated, efficient and holistic manner. In September 2020, Council commenced the Growth Plan project to establish a clear and coordinated long-term strategy. It focused on accommodating growth in line with community expectations around livability, lifestyle, regional character, while providing supporting infrastructure in an affordable and sustainable manner, and maintaining the important natural environment and unique features of our region. The Growth Plan is an important foundation strategy that provides the vision and direction for growth. It will inform how the new planning scheme will facilitate development to achieve that vision. The Growth Plan is not an extension of the short-term land supply, which was a separate study considered by Council in August this year. That study was an analysis of the business as usual policy intent of the current Toowoomba Regional Planning Scheme and the capacity to meet residential land supply when measured against state government median population projections at 2051. It was a snapshot in time that benchmarks the current land supply availability against 2051 requirements. And it also included the findings of development industry workshops, as well as demographic and housing market issues. The study concluded that there's no immediate short-term issue, but there is an important issue that we need to manage in terms of that long-term growth. The new planning scheme is the opportunity and mechanism to bring into supply future residential land through new zoning. And it identified a number of issues that would impact the medium to long-term supply of residential land, as well as housing market challenges in relation to housing choice to meet our changing population and demographics. Therefore, formalising a growth management strategy is an important and key action to informing the planning scheme. Two potential growth options have been developed for the Toowoomba urban extent area, and these options are referred to as convenience option and the new community options. I'd now like to invite Carl Bock to provide an outline of these options, the consultation feedback and the recommendation before you today.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, Mr Mayor, councillors and everyone else in attendance. So I'll just go through some details around the growth plan and delve into each of the options. So for the growth plan, we've proceeded based on utilising medium to high population projections for both options. This equates to a population of 235,000 and 119,000 jobs by 2051. Accommodating for 64,000 new residents, equivalent to 36,000 new jobs. So historically, our planning has been based on medium population projections for the region. However, we're applying a high growth rate to respond to and capitalise on opportunities expected through key infrastructure projects and emerging community economic trends. Both options considered in the growth plan relate to the Toowoomba urban extent area and are based on findings from detailed investigation and analysis on the current form of growth, analysis of economic trends, best practice growth management approaches, and feedback from 3 phases of community and development industry engagement. Both options presented realistic, legitimate approaches for managing both population and employment growth through to 2051. Each option presented in the documentation identifies the potential growth areas where significant amounts of new growth is anticipated. The same potential growth areas are identified under both options, bearing in mind the main difference being the magnitude of growth and the nature of growth for each growth front yields slightly different built form outcomes and settlement pattern outcomes. The convenience option increases the current level of growth within existing urban areas, with growth that is unable to be accommodated within the urban areas, then directed to new greenfield areas that adjoin existing urban areas. Under the new communities option, we see a continuation of the current approach to development within existing urban areas, and we see a greater focus of expansion beyond our current urban areas into new greenfield areas with a focus of creating new local activity centres around these communities. At a high level, the main components of the convenience option are focused on consolidating growth in the existing urban areas, which means increasing density around centres of activities, focusing growth around suburbs close to the Toowoomba city centre, where opportunities for redevelopment can be maximised. It also relies on growth to continue to occur within the Highfields, Westbrook and West Toowoomba areas. Both Drayton and Darling Heights will accommodate both new development and also redevelopment opportunities under this scenario. This ultimately leads to an increased proportion of attached dwellings within the Toowoomba city to create a greater mix of housing. The majority of new housing will still be that of house on blocks, so detached products, providing for a housing mix of 60% detached dwellings and 40% attached dwellings. In comparison, the new communities has a focus on growth and expansion of the existing urban areas at the fringes to create new communities, with an emphasis on focusing growth around Highfields, Westbrook and West Toowoomba. The significant amount of this growth will be through greenfield development, and there will also be growth within the Toowoomba City, Santo Drayton, Darling Heights, reflective of the current situation. This option maintains a current housing mix of 80% detached dwellings and 60% attached dwellings. 20%, thank you. In terms of spatial implications, the convenience option has a lesser impact on expansion into new fringe areas, resulting in less impact on good quality agricultural lands, less impact on interurban breaks, and less impact on scenic amenity. While the new community option has less impact on our existing urban areas, consequently having a lesser impact on our neighbourhood character, heritage buildings, and has reduced land fragmentation challenges that present with redevelopment opportunities. In summary, both options are responsive to good planning outcomes and contemporary policy. They meet our dwelling and employment projections. They provide for good access to employment and open space. They address the natural hazards. They integrate land use and infrastructure planning while addressing community values and aspirations. They address the long-term need for diversity in housing choices, for growth and changing population. They both present logical extensions of the urban footprint. In terms of our rural towns, we've approached growth based on the current or historical situation. So growth is accommodated to 2051 and can be accommodated within the existing zoned land. So sufficient zoned land available to accommodate growth for these communities based on a 91% detached and 9% attached ratio. The growth plan identifies potential growth areas for the rural towns that exceed beyond the zoned areas to provide opportunities should any of these townships experience a growth that's unexpected over that period. These growth fronts are based on areas that are considered suitable for future development after giving consideration to proximity to existing urban areas, consideration of land-based constraints, and infrastructure serviceability. The Officer recommendation in the report recommends that Council endorse the community growth option and the identified rural growth areas as provided in Attachment 1 as a preferred growth option to finalise the growth plan. The rural town growth areas reflect a continuation of the current approach to development in line with community expectations around livability, lifestyle and regional character, while a convenience option is preferred based on a range of factors, giving consideration to an extensive land use planning analysis, considering both qualitative and quantitative methodologies, consideration of the implication of servicing growth and growth fronts in terms of serviceability, based on a strategic level consideration of infrastructure servicing capabilities. It also considers feedback from both community and stakeholder feedback undertaken throughout the preparation. The convenience option is preferred as it provides a range of benefits that we measure in terms of considerations around addressing growth and the need to service community and changing needs. It provides good access to employment, with over 80% of the population at 2051 being within 5 kilometres of a significant employment area. It provides good access to quality open space, with over 80% of the population at 2051 within 500 metres of public open space. It addresses natural hazards to ensure protection of life and property, with no growth being applied to areas of high risk of impact from natural hazards. It integrates land use and infrastructure planning, with over 90% of the anticipated dwellings at 2051 having access to existing or planned urban infrastructure. It addresses a long-term need for diversity in housing choices for growing and changing population. It balances and manages impacts of environmental and landscape values, such as encroachment into agricultural lands, consideration of areas of environmental significance, and preservation of interurban breaks by limiting and avoiding these areas. It presents a logical extension to the urban footprint, and it aligns with the core community values, acknowledging that the protection of character and heritage in existing areas need to be balanced where new redevelopment and opportunities present. So they're the key points that summarise the options available and the officer recommendation to pursue the convenience option.
Any questions for Carl at this point in time? Councillor McDonald?
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Just a question, probably not necessarily to Carl, but to maybe Malcolm or Shannon in regard to the research and findings and what have you. Just in regard to the numbers and how many people have responded or taken part within the survey and from a professional opinion as to whether you felt this was a sample size that was substantive of a very firm decision, or it was substantive of further investigation, given that we've only had 152 surveys and the percentage of 44.7 in favour of one option compared to 42.8 in favour of another option would suggest to me that there's very little from a public perception difference in both, but we know that there is a distinct difference in both. Give it the 60-40 detached at 60, attached at 40, detached at 60, compared to what we have at the moment, which is about 90-10%, 90 of which are detached. So really it was a professional opinion as to whether you thought the sample size was of substantive enough based on 170,000 people in our region to determine, given the fact that there is very little percentage-wise on what the results showed.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll address the first part first. So in terms of it being a sample size, usually there's a 10% requirement to have a sample size, and we haven't hit that. But we have found that the quality of the feedback has been good. What I will say as well is the engagement tasks and the outputs that we've gotten from the workshops, from the survey, and from some of the earlier survey work we did as well, have been informative rather than determinative. So we have taken them on as considerations, but that hasn't been the sole matter that we've based the recommendation to council on with respect to the convenience option. So we did get less than we'd hoped for, but we were confident in our methodology, and our communications team felt comfortable with the quality, as I said, of feedback that was given.
Thank you. If I just kind of a couple, if I could, if that's okay, Shannon. In regard to the projected growth percentages, and we've used a medium to high.
Yes.
Given that our historical growth is around about 1% or thereabouts, give or take a 0.1 or either way, what is the medium to high percentage growth that's been modelled?
Medium to high is 1.13. Mal, can I get you to... I've left one piece of paper behind there because we actually have it... Thank you. I just want to make sure I haven't missed... Sorry, 1.15, Councillor, my apologies. So that's for the urban extent, so the suburbs of Toowoomba City, and then for the townships it was 0.65. So overall across the region we're looking at 1.06. So to come to the medium-high projection, if you'd like me to speak to a little bit to that.
That'd be great. What
we've done is we've based it from the QGSO medium series. So the Queensland Government Statisticians Office have their medium series. They have a low, a medium and a high. Traditionally, land use planning work and a lot of work that's done by Transport and Main Roads and other agencies, education, etc., they use that medium series. So that is what Council has been using. It was what was used to inform the regional plan. When we were doing our first round of consultation, we've heard very clearly from industry that they felt that that wasn't ambitious enough. They wanted to go high. They wanted to go above the QGSO high series. We looked at that professionally. We did some work. We worked with the economists that were working with us from CDM Smith and our demographics expert, Dr. Nick Patanini, and we came to a decision that we could justify a QGSO medium series plus 10%. On net growth, I'll be clear, which takes us to that 1.15. So it's that we think that is a responsible, measured response to that. And the reason we think there is particularly in the Toowoomba urban extent, the capacity to plan, and this is, I'll be very clear, this is planning for more growth, not necessarily saying it's going to necessarily happen, but to have council prepared for it, was because there has been, comparatively to other regions, a huge amount of investment in the region. There's all of the economic factors are lining up to have that higher level of growth, so we felt it was responsible to go to that medium-high projection. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Councillor?
It does. I was expecting it to be a bit higher, actually, to be honest. So 1.15 is what we've
For
settled
Toowoomba
on.
urban extent, for the whole region, it's 1.06.
1.06, okay.
Yeah,
So that's critically important, I guess, for us when we're talking long-term in regard to our infrastructure. And there's a motion coming tomorrow in regard to, a southern water pipeline which connects some of our townships. We're spending some $37 million on the water treatment plant to upgrade it with a forecasted additional water treatment plant of close to $100 million by 2030. So we are planning for growth. That's why it's so important that these figures are realistic, but they're also not understated or completely overstated. Do you know historically what our growth will have been then over the last, say, 4 or 5 years?
I'll have to check that actually, Councillor, but can I take that on notice and come back to you?
Someone else may.
Generally, excuse me, going over that 1% is seen as a growth scenario, because we're talking about average annual growth rate as well. I should have been clearer there, sorry, councillors. So that's the average annual growth rate. Okay. That's not the growth rate between now and 2051 combined. It's year on year. So healthy growth is generally around that 1%, and that's what we plan for. So you are above that, and you are going to experience more growth than other regions are going to see, but comparatively maybe to somewhere like Moreton Bay, which is obviously going crazy at the moment, you're that little bit lower. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks very much, Sharon.
Any further questions? Councillor Megan.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I wanted to ask two things. I'm not sure, Carl, whether, I guess it's probably back to you, Shannon. One, it's on that same theme of the projected growth rates. When you were talking about the major projects that are coming. And I wanted to sort of understand how you can sort of do good planning with spikes in, or anticipation of perhaps what's going to happen. I suppose I just don't really understand that, I guess. Am I making myself clear with my question?
Yes, yeah, if you don't mind, I'll respond to this. So, look, it's impossible to pick those spikes. If we could, then we probably wouldn't need, our lives would be much easier. That was part of the rationale, but part of our rationale for suggesting a slightly higher growth rate or planning for a higher growth rate than medium is that it's highly likely that you're going to get those peaks over this period. And we are talking about 30 years. So today we're thinking 30 years, but within that 30 years, certainly council's going to need to manage that growth over that period and make decisions throughout that 30 years when it comes to planning schemes and zoning land and investment in infrastructure to manage those peaks and troughs as they come along. So you need to monitor that and to think that through as over this next 30 years. But at a base level, and what the sort of decision council's making today, it's prudent, I think, to plan for a higher rate of growth than just medium, because then that gives you forethought and capacity to respond to those peaks and troughs as they come along and make good decisions at that point.
Thanks, Malcolm. Mayor, can I just ask another question? It's about the ratio of the detached to not detached, medium density. So if traditionally we have always had that 90-10 here, how do you see us getting to the 60-40?
Yeah. So 60-40
And
is
making
for the,
sort of assumptions
for the
on
new
that.
growth. That's right. So the philosophy we've taken, and certainly I think it's the decision for council, is that what needs to happen is that council needs to prioritise and make commitment to the sorts of strategies we know that will help and encourage attached housing product in the existing urban area. So that's detailed planning, working through urban design, working through the detailed provisions of the scheme, considering around, giving as many options as you can for the development industry and ultimately community to make those decisions, saying, yes, I'm happy to buy that product in that place. I don't think it's about constraining greenfield. That doesn't work. So ultimately, and well beyond 2050, there will still be a market and a need for house and land in Toowoomba, and that's appropriate. It's totally appropriate as a housing choice. But to get that, to make that mix and to make that sort of shift that this strategy is talking about, it's a commitment to those sorts of strategies and policies to really encourage attached, medium density dwellings in the existing urban area. And again, we've got 30 years, so certainly you wouldn't be trying to achieve all of that now.
Yeah. But you obviously think that that's achievable.
I think, yeah, certainly movement in that direction is achievable. And certainly we were very cautious of presenting two scenarios which we think are plausible and realistic, and they require different effort and different focus and different investment on council over the next 30 years. But we didn't want to present a scenario that is totally implausible. It doesn't really help anyone. It probably makes the decision easier, potentially, but it's not necessarily plausible or realistic.
Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks, Lynn.
Councillor Rebecca and then Councillor Nancy. Rebecca.
Chair, through you, can we have examples of communities where there is currently an 80-20 split and then similarly somewhere there's a 60-40 split? What do those places look like?
I was just checking, I was just checking the figures. So the 60-40 relates to new dwellings. It's not the total mix of dwellings at 2051 as well, because you're obviously dealing with a significant amount of a detached product now. So the question, just to make sure I've got that right, are what are places like which achieve?
Can you tell us where somewhere is that has an 80-20 split and where somewhere that has a 60-40 split, so we can see in our minds, are we talking a Broadbeach? Is that 60-40?
No.
Is it, what is it?
No.
I mean,
Broadbeach would be the other way
what's that
around.
like?
Broadbeach would be the other way around, 90 attached, 10 detached, if not even further.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that one needs a little bit of time.
Yeah,
but
let me have a think about that. Just
because I think that would be illustrative for councillors.
Yeah. I think the challenge is too that we're talking about homes that aren't built yet. So we're talking about a mix into new suburbs and new communities and streets where these developments happen. So we're not talking about, we're talking about 30 years. So it's the nature of how they'll look and the designs and so on will change. But I'll have a think about that specific question.
Thanks. Chair, while that thinking is happening, I wanted to also ask, similarly along Councillor McDonald's lines, about those growth projections. And last week, when in the Water and Waste Committee meeting, we considered the Hodgson Vale and Valeview water supply study for the future, and this takes us out to 2061. The projections that we worked on for that study were significantly higher than what we're looking at here. So for Hodgson Vale, the numbers were for 2026, 1.49%, and then in 5-year increments, and then a 20-year increment, 1.39%, 1.4%, 1.4%, 1.4%. For Valeview, it was 2.13%, 1.92% growth, 1.78%, and that 1.78% holds steady then out to 2061. So in the last week, we've got 2 reports with different growth projections. How do we square this away?
Maybe if I could have a quick go at this one. I think that was based on a much smaller population base. That was talking about growth within those particular neighbourhoods.
Yep.
Wasn't talking about the regional growth figures. So, and one of the things about a 1.06 growth overall is over a large base figure 180,000 people. And so as a significant figure arising from that percentage, it's a much greater impact. There's a lot more people involved. Whereas when you're looking at one suburb only, those percentages are a bit higher. But you are right. And I'm assuming that they have looked at just those neighbourhoods. If they were to apply the overall regional population growth rate, it probably wouldn't have made a lot of sense when they were focusing just on those areas.
So then we ought reasonably expect Westbrook and Highfields and West Toowoomba to have even higher growth projections than Hodgson Vale and Valeview, for example. And we should put Drayton in there as well then if we're...
Well, number-wise, they'll be greater in raw numbers. In percentage terms, possibly not. I mean, I haven't got those figures in front of me, but remembering that percentages are a percentage of that base population. That's all I'm saying. But, I mean, basically, we're talking... Because we're talking about a very high-level strategy here, it's a really settlement pattern, high-level strategic view. We're looking at the regional growth rate and hence we're not looking at individual suburbs. Individual suburbs will have different growth profiles and different percentages based on their existing population. We haven't done that breakdown yet. That's really the next stage. I mean, what we're doing today is really setting a general growth concept or direction that we can then start to look at how we would meet the requirements of that particular high-level strategy. And that would and part of that is looking at all the individual suburbs and their particular growth needs and looking through that lens. But the lens we're looking at the moment is from a very high strategic level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And last one, Chair, thanks. Sorry, I'm toggling back and forth here. The workshop that was held on Wednesday, November 17th, this is workshop number 2, the Business and Development Industry workshop, and there were 29 people registered, 24 attended, and they talked about the key issues being strong agreement with the draft growth statement, disagreement about growth in the city centre, disagreement about growth in Drayton, a view that Westbrook offers greater growth potential than identified, and then each of those issues are elaborated on in the attachment here for us councillors. The question is, how has that feedback, how was that incorporated into the 2 scenarios that are presented before us today?
Thank you, Councillor. It hasn't been as yet. So when we came and presented a couple of weeks ago, I think it was now, we drew out Westbrook, the city centre, and Drayton as the 3 that we would need to do a little bit more work on in the finalisation of the growth plan, which would involve a number of recommendations around how to overcome some of those issues raised by the development industry in terms of their views on the developability, particularly of the city centre and Drayton. And that was what we were seeking some direction on, really understanding how hard council would hold the line on following through with the structure planning that's been done for Drayton, what the appetite was for doing some policy work to encourage more development in the city centre and also a higher level of density, and also some of the work that would need to be done around infrastructure to support Westbrook. So the answer is we're yet to pull that in, and that will be part of, once we have a bit of direction as to what is the preferred today, that is part of our final refinement going into that final growth plan.
Thanks for that information.
Councillor Nancy.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, officers. I just want to preempt by saying that I did my reading on Saturday morning, and my questions and comments are based on Saturday morning, not influenced at all by any emails that I've received from officers or external people since that time. The survey results were, to me, quite disappointing, and Councillor Jeff has covered off on that pretty well. And I came up with the workshops and the drop-ins as well. 232 people have actually influenced this. To me, that's really disappointing. I found that really concerning, that we're making such an important decision and yet that's all the input that we've had. I think it would be truly regrettable if we base the design of future communities on what infrastructure that we can actually afford. I'm concerned whether the inbuilt capacity is actually achievable and what would our communities then look like. The convenience option, I did dot points on the two to try and get it clear in my head. For me, the convenience option equated to congestion, more unit blocks, loss of neighbourhood character, less housing options due to land restrictions. And then the new communities option, I thought it reduced reliance on travel to the CBD if we were having those hubs, the community hubs, the hubs at these planned and designed areas. So if you're creating hubs and communities, which I think, you know, we're trying to achieve that out at Highfields, we're trying to get that CBD functional, and the people out at Highfields have a real dream that employment will happen in their own little CBD so that they are not all coming into Toowoomba every day and that they can actually have their employment out there, particularly for their younger people. I think creating those hubs is a really, really good way to go. It's healthy, it builds communities. If you look at Kingsthorpe, they struggle because everybody at Kingsthorpe commutes into Toowoomba, and so they struggle to find a community there. And we've talked to them at the sporting complex out there, and they said we have trouble getting volunteers because everyone drives back in from out from Toowoomba and they close the door and want to have family time. They don't want to go back out again that night. So it's getting people to go back out that night to go and volunteer somewhere. That's where communities develop. So to me, I think it's important to have those smaller communities and that they're not all reliant on coming to our CBD for employment, and that reduces our traffic congestion at the same time. And it also doesn't restrict the types of housing. I think that's one of the joys about Toowoomba is that people do have the opportunity to live in a detached or an attached, whatever their preference might be. People don't want to have to buy a unit because the house isn't available. People, generally speaking, love Toowoomba because it does have a lot of houses. So I think it's very important that we don't lose our character, our neighbourhood values, all that sort of thing. And I'm really concerned that the convenience option, which to me is really based on cost, on saving of money from building infrastructure, is going to destroy what a beautiful neighbourhood character area that we already enjoy.
Hand over now to Councillor Tim and then
Thanks,
Councillor
Chair.
Bill.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I have to be honest, and I think this is a very important decision that we have today that will really frame how we look in the next 30 years, and I'm not comfortable with the position we've got from the stakeholder engagement that we've done, that we're necessarily ready to make that yet. I'd just like to ask a few questions if I could, and this is from a position of clarify, don't reprimand, curious, not furious. We, in page 40 on board books, and this is to the stakeholder engagement team, it said we targeted 4 key stakeholder groups. First one, industry and business. From a land development, property development, real estate planning, agribusiness, local chambers of commerce, progress associations, industry groups and representatives were targeted in our consultation for stakeholder around this. In the answers that were given in the community consultation, is there anywhere where these kind of specific groups that were a target, what their individual positions on this were? And is there any way to do that? So I'm on page 40 of board books, page 5 of the attachment.
Thanks, Councillor. In the survey, we did ask people to identify, and we could go back in and see how people individually responded. We obviously aggregated those for the reporting. We could talk to our comms team about that. in terms of in the workshops, while our communications team did contact people directly from a range of different organisations, we were certainly more dominated by the development industry in the industry and business workshops and chambers of commerce. So we could draw out some of the information. There wasn't a huge number of free text responses in terms of giving clear direction. So we can do that. As I said, we very much use the survey as more of an informative matter rather than determinative. We did the scenario testing analysis using our geospatial tools, and we've done a number of other policy work with the council officers as well, so that has all come together to, I guess, have that focus on the convenience.
Okay, sure. No, thank you for that. Follow up if I could, and I suppose this is to our team. On page 14 of board books, I'll just go back to there. With our timelines concerning this is really the last stage before we go out. So this is 1102, it says on the bottom. This is the last stage, active engagement with a broad range of stakeholders and community members to generate feedback before we present the Toowoomba Region Growth Plan. And I'm just wondering to our team, if we were to hypothetically not come to a decision today, how would that delay the rest of this, number 6, which is the preparation of the Toowoomba Region Growth Plan as far as timelines? And could you just examine a bit those timelines you're on? Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Councillor Tim. Could I talk about this in two parts? The first is that whilst it would be the last formal engagement process for the growth plan, the Toowoomba Region Futures has an ongoing community engagement program right through the duration of this project, culminating in the final review of the planning scheme. So the feedback from the community is gathered at all of those stages, and the next phase for us will be actually the strategic framework. So that will be the higher policy area that will form the intent of the planning scheme, and at this stage we are looking to undertake engagement of that in early next year, being informed by the growth plan. So while this part of the project would conclude, there are still other opportunities going forward. I would say, though, that the importance of this project is also to help us start to build in the other tools that we require that provide us with a much higher level of detail to our next phases of planning. And due to the time constraints on delivery of the program overall, we have had to run a number of projects and sub-projects in parallel. So we've run a number of 15 studies all in parallel, and we've been doing them at the same time that we've been doing the growth plan. So we've tried to build in those synergies throughout those processes, which takes effort. The next phase, which is the drafting work, is actually informed by the outcomes of this. So a delay in consultation might only be pushed back a month or so, but the real implication is the work that sits behind that, because from the outcomes of this process, we would go on to develop a model which is kind of a combination of a spreadsheet and GIS basis that allows us to look at the yields and projections in those neighbourhood areas. And that will help us to inform what kind of areas we might need to upzone or bring into supply. And that also helps to inform our strategic infrastructure network planning and understanding what the infrastructure needs are associated with that, and that contributes to the LGIP. Potentially, a delay in a decision now, or if there required substantial rework post-consultation with the strategic framework, could be potentially 6 months, but it would be something we would need to come back, having considered the resources available to us, whether consultants are still available, given their work that they may have on the books, the impact on other parts of the organisation. So significantly, development services would be involved in reviewing and drafting, reviewing of the draft content of the planning scheme. So it's a bit of a flow-on effect. We would have to come back, but my initial thought would be we would potentially be looking at perhaps 6 months.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Carl.
Thanks, Chair. Just some comments, if I may. Is that all right? For me, today's meeting is about, really importantly for us, it's around the priorities. In being sure that we don't confuse it with land use planning, with percentages, with growth rates. And the reason why I say that is because this is a framework, regardless of the percentage of growth. This is a framework that will inform the underlying policy and priorities that the technical people need to set in order for us to hit the dartboard 30 years from now with the dart. So with that, regardless of the 80-20, 20 attached, 80 detached, or whether it's 90, and there was some discussion this morning in the UDIA meeting, and whether 60-40 is pie in the sky and even 30 years into the future. But what it does do is help prioritise the really important parts of those growth fronts or corridors, whatever you want to call them. It either puts barriers in the way of the development sector, or it enables. And under a nodal approach, the convenience model, within walking distance of a major activity centre, it allows less barriers for more living choice. So under a do the same policy, and this is where we're running into and where the current planning scheme, some components have outlived its useful life around growth. And this is why we need a growth management plan, not a land use plan. That's the next phase, which the officers have alluded to, and that will be tested, and there will be a lot of consultation and discussion around more detailed planning. But we've got to know what model we're aiming for. So we can choose to have a priority where it's much more focused on more of the same, and have the priorities around the new communities. You'll still have infill, and I'm not just talking about the brownfield areas in the Toowoomba city or in townships. You'll have some more densely populated areas or residential or building densities in these new communities, but you'll have less priority under a new communities option, which means there is less propensity and it's more open to a piece of land being carved up as house and land. Under a new communities, you have more of a opportunity to be able to, in the new areas, to be able to look at future nodes being developed with less barriers in place. For me, I mean, it's extremely important that we make a decision today. 6 months will put, and I beg to differ, Michelle, I think 6 months is a conservative estimation given the snowball effect on the whole of council organisation in getting data in a timely fashion and being able to collate that in the gateways along this planning process. So I think it's really important that we keep in mind that it's simply about the priority that we set and not limiting either detached dwellings but allowing for more detached dwellings and allowing for more attached dwellings where appropriate under best practice planning models around nodes, not just the existing nodes, but nodes in the future that will emerge, and particularly in the donut area of Toowoomba, around the old statistical district. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Carl. I'll hand over now to Councillor McDonald. You have a question?
Thanks, Mayor. No, I haven't actually. I've got a recommendation to put forward for Council's consideration. And Wendy should have it there to put up on screen. And then I'm happy to talk to it if someone wants to second it. The Council used the findings outlined in the Toowoomba Region Futures Toowoomba Region Growth Plan preferred growth option to inform further community engagement in determining the Toowoomba Region Growth Plan, and 2, that the Planning and Development Group present to Council a proposed revised timeline for delivery of the new Toowoomba Region Planning Scheme.
Councillor Rebecca, you're seconding the motion?
I'll second that.
Okay, thank you.
Happy to talk to it then, Mayor.
Is there anyone wishing to speak against the motion?
I want to understand it a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, Councillor McDonald, you may.
Just as a pre-debate, if you like, to get the conversation started. Look, councillors, in particular Councillor Carl, I respect very much the words that you've said and the importance of making a decision today. But I guess and I flagged it actually in the information session around the numbers of community people or people generally that have got involved in this process. And if the worst case scenario, let's call it worse given the information we've had, between 1 and 6 month delay, probably the latter, when we're considering a 30-year plan, I think the 6 month delay is worthwhile to make sure that we get this right, or as right as we possibly can. And that's why I'm proposing the first motion actually acknowledges what we've done to this point, acknowledges that, in fact, I have to say the amount of engagement that we've offered the community to do has been enormous. It actually has been enormous, where all the various touch points that we've had. It's been underwhelming as far as the response is concerned, and that'd be fine if it was, say, a 90-10 percentage rate of one way or the other. But this is so close. This is so close that I can't hand on heart say that, and I've got to be honest with you, I'm probably around that middle area as well. I just don't think that we're at a point in the process that we can honestly say, hand on heart, that in 30 years' time we want the option that's been put forward as a recommendation. And I think for the sake of 6 months we have that opportunity to do it. Now, knowing full well that this will take time, knowing full well that we've got a motion on our books to complete the planning scheme in 2024, knowing all of those things, we have an obligation for this period of time, but not for this term of council. We have an obligation to make the best decisions possible for this community for the next 30 years. So I think the second part of the option gives officers an opportunity to come back to council with that chance, and this is really a checkpoint in time, if you like, that in February, based on what Michelle has said, there'll be further consultation with community to look at that strategic objective, strategic plan of the planning scheme. So I actually see it as valuable what we've done to date. I see it valuable that we're actually having this discussion. And I have to say, this isn't to me about land supply. Not at all. This is not about land supply, because both options, you have the same result of people living here. It's got absolutely zero to do with land supply. This is about the engagement of people, okay, and it's about the opportunity we have to actually increase that level of engagement. Now, there's a variety of options to do that, but that's the reason for the motion. So 2 parts. First one is acknowledge what we've done, use it as the basis to consult, and option 2 is let's be realistic. We're putting pressure back on the organisation to do these things. We also need to understand this will take more time, may take more resources, and that's what we need to be aware of by accepting these couple of motions.
Councillor McDonald, do you wish to speak against the motion, Councillor Carl?
I want to hear what the officer has to say.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I want to hear what the officer has to say, Mr Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Really, I'm just asking for a little bit of extra clarification around that first option there. We would be going out next year in relation to the strategic framework, which is Council's higher order policy, its strategy. And as part of that, it does encompass an approach to the settlement pattern. So I guess the question would be what would Council like us to include in that strategic framework in order to consult with the community? Just seeking some additional clarification on what you think that might look like. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And through you, Mr Chair, if I could. Michelle, I'm quite happy to add additional words in there, something along the lines of can go, or something to include the strategic actions that you're talking about, that next phase. So this is a stop, but it actually will, and because because there's no clear winner of the two options, I just think we need to be very careful of just saying saying it at those sessions, there was no clear option here. We need to, through this process, actually get a clear option, and that may help. So whether we need to add a couple of things on the end of that first motion that says help inform the discussions around strategic intent or strategic vision, would that cover what you're saying?
To a certain extent. So the draft strategic framework will form what actually goes into the planning scheme. And it's written in a way that reflects that, plus there are some associated materials to explain what that means. So from an officer perspective, at the moment, we would be wanting to include a preferred direction in that content, but we could certainly build into the consultation the opportunity to include the outcomes of the growth plan and seek further clarification. But it would be preferable for us to be able to consult on a settlement pattern option within the strategic framework, but perhaps it might be that through that process we would not necessarily embark on the other associated work, such as finalising the model and all of that work, which might require significant rework if there was a change or additional feedback obtained through that consultation. Could be one mechanism, but otherwise we're essentially going out to, if we go out with both options again, we're essentially repeating the past processes. So it's council's preference.
Yeah, no, follow up with that if I could. And I guess this is the problem of where we are now. We haven't had, in my mind, 100, what have we got? 152 people, and to have the eight drop-ins, and we had, what did we have? 13 people in Yarraman in one session. We had 3 sessions in Toowoomba, we had a total of 6 people. So I just think that somehow we've got to do that better, or we change that process and have, like we had with the CBD formation of the revitalisation of the CBD all those years ago, where there was a panel of people that were involved and, a cross-section of community. So somehow we've got to do that better when they are so close. So perhaps it's really about utilising, as that says there, the report. So these guys have actually said that this is their option that they've preferred. So there's nothing wrong with, it's not a council decision that this was the preferred. At this point, the consultation or our consultants have suggested this is the option that we should do. I don't have a problem with that, but I have a problem with council making a decision that that's the option in front of a community when it's so close. That's my view. I'm more than happy to have other views, but I just think if it's part of the consultant's remit to suggest an option, and they've done that, it's now council's choice whether we accept that option or something different.
Malcolm, you just wish to make a comment?
Yeah, to talk to that. I think I'm certainly conscious that you're obviously going into the strategic framework. Council, community get opportunity to comment on that. You then draft the planning scheme. Community get opportunity to comment in detail on that as well. And so the decision today, although it is an important decision of council, it does set a framework for further work. It's not something that should be. It is important, but it shouldn't be considered that you're locking this in without capacity to modify and amend and respond to community expectations over time. That's how the planning system works, and it's going to continue to work like that. So I'm not saying it's not important, but it is. It's not as not as if you don't get to come back and revisit it. Not as if the community doesn't get several opportunities in the short term, in the next couple of years, to actually engage with this and see what it means. Because the other thing is that this is 30 years, the growth plan. The planning scheme will have, say, a 15-year horizon. So it's far more tangible and immediate, and the ability for the community to actually understand what does this mean. I think you'd be far more likely to get that feedback. So I suppose what I'm saying is that there may be benefits in terms of the level and the nature of the community engagement you get going out with the strategic framework, rather than potentially repeating what we've already done.
Thank you. I just had a couple of questions lined up. Rebecca, Michelle, did you want to make a further comment?
No, so, following up from Malcolm, on that basis, the settlement pattern strategy of the strategic framework, if we were to proceed based on the findings as recommended by the consultants in the growth plan, we would be taking out a convenience option and testing that with the community.
Yeah, and I guess that's where I'm quite comfortable with that, but it's not a council decision that we've gone one or the other. Because I don't think I wouldn't be in favour of that. But I'm in favour if there's a consultant that said, this is what it is, which is part of that phase of consultation, then I'm quite happy with that.
The other issue there is which you've alluded to in the second part of your recommendation, is the impact on the ongoing program of works. And that's really more the practical issues associated with achieving a deadline and having to run some of those processes in parallel. My recommendation, I'm a little bit concerned about the potential for significant rework in that technical space, which does take time. So perhaps that option to come back and address those issues with you would be our preferred option in that basis.
Just checking, Michelle, that covers that off that in number 2 though, does it?
Yes, it does in number 2. So perhaps the wording of number 1, if I may offer a suggestion for Council's consideration, the Council used the findings outlined in the Toowoomba Region's Futures Toowoomba Region Growth Plan, preferred growth option outcomes, to inform further community engagement in relation to the strategic framework.
Yeah, that seems good to me.
Terming the Toowoomba regions. Yep. Okay. So I've got a few questions, and it's outside the normal, I guess we are in debate. We are, in fact, putting a resolution forward. But I'll take some questions, and I'll take Councillor Rebecca and then Councillor Megan, followed by Councillor Bill and Councillor Nancy.
Okay, Chair,
and
thanks.
Tim, sorry, you're in there too. Councillor Rebecca.
Thank you, Chair. So before Councillor McDonald put that before us, I wanted to actually talk about the land supply figures, because to my mind, this is a big decision, and confidence is a really big part of what we're considering here today. And I think that it's essential that we have confidence in the information, not just us, but the community, has confidence in the information going into what we're considering, so that then they can have confidence in what comes out of the decision-making process. Because everybody around this table understands that the decision we make today will frame what follows. And while there is conjecture about those land supply figures, as an input, that means to me that there isn't confidence in what is being considered. And so I understand what has been said about it being a snapshot, but the question, which I guess has now been addressed by the motion and why I've seconded it, is the extent to which those numbers that there is conjecture about, the data, has been an input into this information, and that is my reason, because I think that there is conjecture, and that conjecture leads to questions about confidence. So to me, it's pretty simple. We need confidence in so that we can have confidence out.
Thank you for that. Councillor Megan, comment please.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I guess I just wanted to pick up on two things. One, I think, Shannon, you said before to have a statistically significant result or feedback, you'd need a 10%. Is that what you said? So we're talking, is it achievable? Is it even possible to get that type of result?
17,000.
Yeah.
No, not in my experience. Generally, the longer term that we're talking, the more difficulty councils or state government has in getting people interested and involved. So I wouldn't be confident that you could get to that figure. Hence why we always use our survey and our engagement responses as information in rather than the only thing that we base our decision on or our recommendations on.
And just while you're there, I just wanted to sort of make a comment or ask a question. There's, of course, having the community perspective is important, but I would imagine that there's good planning principles, and good planning principles is why you've suggested the convenience model. So I just sort of urge councillors that we've got experts giving us their advice. We're never going to make everyone happy. So I think, we sort of, I don't know what we're going to know in 6 months that we don't know now. That's what I worry about. Sorry, Shannon, you don't have to make a comment on that now.
Yeah, our assessment really won't change. So a big part of what we have based the final recommendation on was our scenario testing and analysis. Now, the options did come out closely, and as I've said before, we stand behind both of the options. They are realistic, they are plausible, and both of them we feel could be applied, and we would stand behind them as professionals. Convenience edged out mostly because of the value that community placed on green space, and also limiting impacts, any sort of, sorry, I've lost my word, conflict with potential natural hazards as well. So one thing that we did very early in the process is, through a geospatial analysis, is remove and do yield reduction on land that had any sort of constraint or environmental values on it, so that we weren't assigning growth to places where it really realistically couldn't happen, or it was going to happen in a way that was in conflict with the community values. So yeah, there's not a whole lot that's going to change in 6 months from our technical perspective. As Mal has said, this is the first stage in a number of steps that council will be taking to get to the pointy end, being development on the ground. So I feel very confident in our policy perspective, and council's done good planning. There's been structure planning done for Drayton, there's been structure planning done for West Toowoomba, but that still stands and has a lot of merit.
Thank you, Shannon. Megan, anything else? Councillor Bill, and then Councillor Tim.
Are we debating or?
Oh, look, I think we did reach the stage, Bill, and I made it fairly clear that I'll take a number of questions. But if you wish to speak against the motion, if Tim has a quick question, I'll take that from him first. And then if you wish to speak against the motion, Councillor Bill, I'll then do that.
Thank you, Chair, and I won't keep Councillor Bill. My question is just for Councillor Jeff. When we talk about the two options, the convenience and new communities, yours says use the findings outlined. Does your motion suggest we use the convenience as the original, or there's no talk of either in your motion?
No, there's no council decision on either motion, but it is saying that the consultants are suggesting the first one, the convenience one. That's what it's suggesting. So when they move to the strategic framework, they can talk through that, but it's not a council decision to go down that path.
Thank you. I just needed that clarification. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Nancy, did you have a question?
Yes, I did, Mr Mayor. Sorry, you had a line up there and you've obviously just forgotten, but that's all right. The thing that I meant to mention earlier was when we do a survey like this, and if we do end up going back out again, I think one question that needs to be at the end of each and every question that's asked is, would you live next door? Because many people are happy to dictate what others do while they live in their own little kingdom, wherever that may be, not impacted, and yet you read in the paper all the time about people who are impacted, have their lifestyles impacted by somebody next door doing a great big development where once there was this lovely little old house that fell apart through neglect, and we end up with a complete change in the character of the hood. So I think it's really important that people who are giving you their thoughts on what they think they would like to see, would you live next door? And that goes for all of us as well, in my view.
Thanks, Councillor Nancy. Councillor Bill, you wish to speak against the motion? We'll go back into debate.
Yeah, there's no more questions.
No, we've gone into debate now.
Righto. Yeah, I'll speak against the motion because I don't think it really achieves anything. I'm struggling to find the real intent. We've just heard from the professionals about how there may not be any change at all to the technical input, given the rigour that they've gone through. And part of that rigour will be engagement with all the technical experts, the internal stakeholders, the constructors of the networks on those future growth fronts, and what the likely inhibitors are and opportunities are. That would have all been unpacked with the people we charge with the responsibility to build those networks, or in fact service them for the whole of life. So, and I do think, there's no dancing around the obvious, I do think that under a new communities model, that we are kicking the tin down the road to an affordability issue with potentially a greater extent of urban sprawl and less return on investment around densities, sensibly around a nodal approach. I'm not talking about densities anywhere. We've tried that one. We did the higgledy-piggledy with the dual occupies and the units sprawled everywhere, willy-nilly around units, and that's where the objection did come. We learnt, hopefully. The point I'd like to reiterate, and it was very well put by the officer, our consultant, the information is always informative, not determinative. And you heard how there is a consistent theme around the extent of input from community. The only time you get community respond of recent times and in history was when we proposed to do the wrong thing at Highfields, and we got plenty of input and feedback. It is a question about the real intent. What will we come away with? And I disagree with not a council decision. That's what we're around the table for, to make a decision based on the best inputs to move forward, because the officers need to know from the decision-making forum or panel or board of council about which scenario do we implement. So I think it's, I struggle to see the real benefit of this motion as it stands. And I will probably draw lots of comment for that, but I urge councillors to consider that this is about setting a context and priorities of which there will be subsequent iterations and numbers of opportunities to flesh out the detail along the way under a model. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Carl. Councillor Tim, you wish to speak for or against?
For, thank you, Chair. I'd love the opportunity to. I thank Councillor Jeff for bringing this up. If I could just highlight a few things. The more I've read through these papers over the weekend, the more it just isn't adding up to me. And we are representatives of the community. The community needs to be involved in everything we do. And we have a big decision ahead of us. Let's not take this lightly. This is going to, today's meeting, influence what Toowoomba region looks like in the next 30 years. Yet we have very, very low numbers of consultation. That's not the fault of anyone doing the consultation. They even acknowledge there's perhaps fatigue, or they don't quite clarify the understanding of the ideas around that, but very low numbers of consultation that the community's come forward, and the results are 45 and 42%. Now, I'm not sure is higher than I've ever seen it. Now, I'm not sure I want to base such a significant decision around 3% difference when they're both neither here nor there. They're both up there and they're both very close. I think that we have two issues here, convenience and emerging communities, that are so finely intertwined that, you know, there's so much similarities around both of them that it's in itself a hard question for the community to answer. I saw a lot of, when we were briefed on this, questions around, I'd like that, but that can be for the new people coming to town where I'm going to continue living this way. And those kind of comments were interesting when we're taking this into account. But I certainly think the community, we should go back to them and do this properly. And I'm not saying ask the same questions. I'm saying I don't feel as a council we're in a position that we should be making the decision on this as yet. Of course, those findings are valid, and of course we should take them into account as the motion suggests. Use the findings that we've already got to inform further community engagement. Go back to the community and have another look on this, and let's get it right. So I welcome this motion. I thank Councillor Jeff for bringing it. Thank you for letting me speak for it.
Councillor Nancy, do you wish to speak against the motion?
I'm unsure, Mr Mayor.
You're unsure? Well,
Yeah. So-
we're actually in formal debate here, so you'd better
Yeah.
just make it pretty clear pretty
All
quickly.
right, so my concerns are, one, we've been told, unless I heard it wrong, was that we won't get any increase in interaction by going back and consulting with the community further. But the second thing is the plan to go back to the community for further engagement based on the convenience option? Because if that's the case, I'm definitely voting against it. But if we're going back to the community with both options, I'm happy to let it ride. But if we're going back with just the convenience option, I'm dead against it.
So that might be something
So
I
some
could...
clarity?
Can I perhaps give some clarity around that? So the idea of option one is that we use the findings, and part of the finding is that the consultant has given that option as the preferred option that they've seen, but both options, all options are on the table. So it's not a council decision that we've said that's the option. So it wouldn't be going out to say convenience option's the only thing. That's what the strategic framework will help.
So
frame
both
it.
options will be proposed
Both
to
options
the communities.
and other options, I'd suggest to you. There could be a blend. There could be
Yeah.
could be something come out of that hasn't even been spoken of.
Okay, so long as the staff and the consultants, I'm assuming those consultants are going to do it, are well aware that that is the case and that they're not just going to go out with the convenience option, I'll support this.
Thanks, Councillor Nancy. Well, I think, is there anyone wishing to speak against the motion?
Yeah, could I just ask for a staff comment on Councillor Summerfield's?
Okay, if it can be brief, we're getting to
that
the...
just happened there.
Yep.
In order for us to effectively consult on what would be a future policy platform for the planning scheme, it would be preferable for us to have that content form part of that draft. And on that basis, for clarity of consultation, I personally feel that it would need to reflect the recommendation of the consultant in line with the councillor's recommendation that the consultant's preferred growth option come through, which would be convenience. What we would do to acknowledge that there are other options on the table is in the associated collateral material. We would obviously make reference and make available all of this documentation around the growth plan, but would need to, I think, more explicitly point out what the key differences would be in that process and allow people to make feedback. It would be very difficult, in my viewpoint, it would be very difficult to put a strategic framework out unless you had a fully strategic framework drafted in one way to reflect a new communities option and one to reflect a convenience option. Now, if that could be another way to present that to the community. There's a degree of effort and work attached to being able to fit all of that into a document, and you'll be asking people to decide A or B, essentially, which is the two options that have been already presented.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. Well, we might move. Councillor McDonald, do you wish to sum up? Oh, Councillor Nancy, yes?
If you don't mind, Mr Mayor, could I suggest that that be reworded to say that both options be presented? Because I can't support it unless that is the case.
I'm happy for that to be in there.
Happy for that to be in. Well, I was planning on going back to the mover and the seconder to make sure we had the wording right before we put the motion. So can we do that in a moment, please?
I think in brackets you'd put, would you put in brackets? Inclusive of both options, close bracket.
May I add, if it's possible, the implication is most going to be felt in the level of mapping that we would need to prepare to reflect those two options rather than necessarily the words. So I would need to seek advice from our professionals and GIS about how long it would take to provide essentially duplicates of each approach, and we would potentially need to come back to you to see what impact that would have in relation to us coming to council with the strategic framework report in January, which was our anticipated timeframe to be able to commence engagement in February.
Councillor Summerfield.
Sorry to ask another question, but I'm just wondering what mapping was provided to them in the first place then, if that's the case.
The mapping provided in the growth plan options is contained in the reports, and it is quite a blobby style map. Where the difference in the mapping would be most substantially impacted is in relation to some of the overlays and so forth that might form part of the strategic framework. I would probably prefer to seek the advice of our principal planner, Heath Martin, as to what implications there may be in terms of that mapping drafting and how that's currently being thought through to understand what those implications would fully be. Certainly the mapping of the two options is already available, but it's overlaying it against other features of the planning scheme and then producing a strategic map that provides more guidance about interurban breaks, for example, all of those aspects, the extent of where development would potentially occur, particularly in this first phase of the planning scheme, given this is a 30-year strategy around growth. We're likely to see at least another iteration of a planning scheme that will contribute to the development of this. So,
If I can make a comment?
Yes, Councillor McDonald. Councillor Carl, you've got a brief comment as well, have you?
Sorry, question, sorry.
Just a question, Councillor McDonald.
Yeah, look, I'm comfortable with that. I actually think that's a critically important piece of work, actually, if it takes more time to do it, because we need to think that in 30 years' time, what it will look like. Okay, so if we actually get a clearer understanding of what that mapping does look like, where things are, what the overlays are, all of those things, we can actually make an informed decision on that. At the moment, I've got to be honest with you, I'm struggling to make that firm decision, given a vision of not this term, but another 7 terms, 8 terms.
Thank you. Councillor Carl, you've got a brief comment as well.
Yeah, Chair, it was through you to Michelle, the officer. Michelle, are we in danger of making further assumptions and getting the cart before the horse going down this path? Because my understanding and working through this over many briefings with councillors and listening to the feedback that's come back, isn't it isn't it important for us that this overarching framework, if we deliberately kept it as a, what did you describe it, a blobby plan, because we have to enrol the stakeholders at the next stage of more detailed planning. But aren't we, if we go down this track, aren't we potentially making more assumptions aside from those stakeholders?
I'm not entirely clear whether we would be making more assumptions. The strategic framework map that we would produce is by its very nature a very high level map.
Yeah.
So we certainly wouldn't be using this as an indication of, limits to zone pattern and therefore development at this stage. That's really something that is necessary to get a further, more refined level of information from. So the assumptions that are inputs to this phase of the project, in my view, wouldn't necessarily change.
But you indicated that you would need to have two plans under the scenarios. So therefore there has to be assumptions, more assumptions, whereas those initial planning was applicable to either a new communities or a convenience model. There really wasn't a lot of detail, and we heard from our consultants that no, it hasn't been tested because it deliberately needs then to be tested, and the other more detailed level of consultation with those critical stakeholders needs to take place at that stage. So my question is, are we in danger of actually having to make some more assumptions ahead of time when the more suitable approach, in my view, would be to actually have that dartboard, crude analogy, but have the dartboard, something to aim at, and then we go and say, well, righto, here's how we propose to unpack this.
The assumptions that we use to inform the growth management strategy and the two options that are presented here, the inputs to that process from constraints, the valuable features, all of those aspects, they are the same. It's how we respond to those that are different, and therefore those inputs would not necessarily change our assumptions. What would change is our approach and response to managing and facilitating whatever option council wishes to go through. It is necessary, and I would suggest particularly if council wishes to take two options out as part of the strategic framework discussion, it really is necessary then for us to receive some direction post that, and whatever consultation occurs, to then start to do the additional work that you've just described there, Councillor Carl, which is to consider at a very lot level basis what the iteration over the next 15 to 20 years would be out of that 30-year program, how that intersects with what's on the ground. We would further refine that and ground truth that with input during that process. So if I could sum up, in my view, the assumptions that are inputs to this project would not necessarily change. It's the response and way we would manage that through a policy process that would be what is the determinant.
Could I have a quick comment, Mr Mayor? Yeah, look, to pick up where Michelle was, look, we are talking here in both the growth options and the strategic framework at a very high level strategic documents. And in a sense, it could be counter to good strategic thinking and maybe make more complex the whole consideration of the strategy directions if we go down to too much of a detailed level. I think, really we're talking about going out in February, March with the strategic framework. Part of that framework certainly envisages whether we have a convenience or a new communities option. In a sense, there is some logic to that. I don't see it as illogical at all. And really, at the strategic level, the detail on the ground is probably not going to change all that much. The mapping that we've already done, blobby as it might be, is still sufficient to give some indication of the of where we're going with either of those options. But it's important, I think, and that, you know, if we're going to go out there with the strategic framework and the settlement pattern, for want of a better term, then we do it, and we do it with with strategic mapping. We really wouldn't want to be going down into cadastral level. We really wouldn't want to be talking about X number of lots versus Y number of lots, because it's supposition. It's too far out. And we need to consider our strategy so that it informs our policy drafters going forward. If the community comes back and says, no, we really want new communities in association with our strategic framework, then they're the policies. And if council agrees with that, they're the policies that we draft. So I think we've probably got enough in terms of that, of the mapping, to go out with those two options. That's my Bob's work.
Okay, councillors, look, I think we've probably had a very fruitful discussion here, and I thank you all very much for your input. And of course, if I can use that common phrase of mine, we're on a journey, and I think we probably have the management of that journey as we go forward. Councillor McDonald, if you wish to sum up, and then we'll vote.
Mr Mayor, I think it's probably enough said. I think I'd just reiterate, for the sake of between 1 and maximum 6 months and the additional effort over a 30-year period of the life of this growth plan, I think we owe it to our community to make sure that we do everything we possibly can to get it as right as we possibly can for the next 30 years. So therefore, happy to move 1 that's in blue and 2 that's in yellow.
Yep.
1 that's in blue, 2 that's in yellow.
Can I ask the mover and the seconder if they're comfortable with the wording of the 2 sections of the resolution?
Comfortable with 1 that's in blue and 2 that's in yellow.
I didn't quite catch that.
It's disappeared now. We've just got
There's
2
2
got sorted?
1 and 2 that's before us. Thank you.
Righto. That's right. We had 2 1s. Good. Councillor McDonald, you're comfortable with it?
Present? Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Yep. Okay, councillors, I'll put that to the vote. Those who are in favour? Those who are against? Wish to have your votes recorded? Councillors, that motion is carried. We'll now, I'll close the meeting, and thank you very much for your attendance. And we'll have a quick break, and then we're back in here for another information session. Thank you very much.